this in Luxembourg. Astonishing. I spoke at the British Chambers of Commerce there a couple of years ago. They're one of the quietest group of people, one of the quietest places I've ever been to. Extraordinary. And that continued right throughout the day. Here was Boris Johnson responding to today's meetings.
Over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of work. Papers have been shared, but we are now in the stage where we have to start really accelerating the work. And that was the agreement today with Jean-Claude Juncker and with Michel Barnier. And look, I don't want to get people's, we've got to manage this carefully. Yes, there is a good chance of a deal. Yes, I can see the shape of it. Everybody can see roughly what could be done.
Well, that was Boris Johnson in a quiet area. And next was the most extraordinary thing. The Luxembourg Prime Minister had planned a press conference right next to the gates where the protests were taking place. And you heard the noise in the first clip that I played. An extraordinary area for a press conference. It seemed to be on loud microphones that were echoing all around the square. And not surprisingly, Boris Johnson did not go and stand at that podium. So the Luxembourg Prime Minister, who I would have thought in the circumstances, if he'd chosen, could have done a press conference inside somewhere. No, he just continued, and this was his theme.
I think demonstrating is a right in a democracy.
Oh, we know whose side he's on then, don't we?
And it is important also to be able to exchange and to listen to each other. There are no concrete proposals for the moment on the table. And I won't give an agreement to ideas. We need written proposals, and the time is ticking. So stop speaking, but act if you want that we are able to discuss about different proposals. But we won't accept any agreement who goes against the single market or who will be against the Good Friday Agreement. Now it's on Mr. Johnson. He holds the future of all UK citizens and every EU citizen living in the UK in his hands. It's his responsibility. Your people, our people, count on you. But the clock is ticking. Use your time wisely. Thank you.
I mean, just extraordinary. I mean, this is just extraordinary. And before the 6 o'clock news, Eddie had a guy on the phone who'd been 30 years a cameraman, been to press conferences all over the world. He said, look, I'm not a Boris fan, I'm a Remainer, but I have never seen a press conference set up right next to protesters. This looked to me to be totally stage managed. And just to rub it in, just to show us that this was all about ritual, humiliation, in my view, here was the Luxembourg Prime Minister talking about Boris with an empty podium next to him.
I wanted to thank Mr. Johnson,
oh, it's funny, you see,
who was here today for the exchange.
It's funny, it's really funny. I mean, you just can't believe these people. I think the whole thing was a ritual humiliation. Joining me to talk about a couple of the issues that arise from it is LBC's political editor, Theo Usherwood. Theo, Boris talked today about papers being exchanged, and then Xavier Bettel, the Luxembourg Prime Minister, said he'd seen nothing concrete. Do any of us have any idea what progress might have been made?
Boris Johnson and his team within Number 10 do not want to have these negotiations out in the open. And ultimately they fear that if they put together a written proposal, a document, it would soon find its way into the European media and subsequently the British media because it would be leaked by the European side. And so they want to have confidential discussions, reach a point where there is an agreement with the European Union, and then make a submission formally, which they have to do, to the European Union, which then can be signed off at the European Council summit in the middle of October. And today's visit to Luxembourg was supposed really to be the start of that process, so that Boris Johnson could meet Jean-Claude Juncker, the outgoing president of the Commission, set the parameters of what he was trying to achieve. The Sherpas, as they call them, the aides who actually carry out the negotiations, could go away, get on with finding an agreement, particularly around the backstop and the Northern Irish border, which may look something like Theresa May's agreement, and then that could be signed off and that could be signed off at the summit. Boris Johnson can then pass it in that week before October the 31st. Would then leave the European Union on October the 31st, and then there'd be a general election, and Boris Johnson, having delivered Brexit, his plan would be then to say that he has been a successful Conservative Prime Minister and that everybody should vote for him. That was the plan. Now, what Xavier Bettel did today is very similar to what Emmanuel Macron, the French president, did in Salzburg 12 months ago before Theresa May signed the withdrawal agreement. It was about making a stand, saying that the European Union wasn't going to stand for this Brexit. It was out of order the way Boris Johnson had behaved, and making a plea to the British people not to abide by it. And you heard it in that excerpt of his speech that you played out there. But, and there is a big but to this, there's a feeling, certainly in number 10, that actually that stunt has backfired on Bettel, that actually it plays very well, because Boris Johnson is saying, I'm trying to find a deal. Meanwhile, Xavier Bettel had the opportunity to call the press conference inside, away from the protesters.
Yeah, it could all have been done.
So the journalists could have, but he didn't want to do it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. Theo, thank you very much indeed. And Theo, very much agreeing with me. I mean, this was, and we saw it with Theresa May, this was another ritual humiliation of a British Prime Minister done in Luxembourg, one of the most hypocritical countries that exists in the world, a country that constantly talks about European integration, apart from their own tax codes, apart from their own excise duties. I mean, quite extraordinary. You drive through Luxembourg and the queues to get petrol and diesel are huge because it's 30 to 40% cheaper than it is on t'other side in France. Alcohol is ridiculously cheap. Cigarettes are almost free. They're so cheap in Luxembourg. And of course, we know that Mr. Juncker, who for 19 years was the Prime Minister, doing all sorts of remarkable deals on corporation tax with companies going and setting up in Luxembourg and paying as little as 3%. I mean, talk about who are not the good Europeans. I'd have thought it's them, not us. But Boris humiliated. Do you think that it really must now be time to leave? But if not, if you're on the side of the protesters, you tell me why on 0345 6060 973. If, like me, you think it was appalling, these people are unreasonable, there's never going to be a deal worth having, text to 84850. And coming up later, we'll play a clip of Guy Verhofstadt at yesterday's Lib Dem conference saying the European Union must become an empire. Love your thoughts on that ahead of the clip by tweeting using the hashtag Farage and LBC, at LBC, and of course Twitter, Facebook and YouTube watchers can comment too. Simon is a new caller from Southampton. Good evening, Simon.
Hi, Nigel.
Well, welcome to the show.
Bear with me because I've got a stinking cold.
Oh, poor thing. Now, I mean, do you think I'm right that he was humiliated, or should he expect to have to face these crowds at a press conference?
Well, of course he should. I mean, if he can do it in Prime Minister's Question Time, well, although we've only ever seen it once, he can do it any time. Now, look, this is my take on it, okay? I'm absolutely disgusted with the way that this has been spun, right? The man has come out on the media over the weekend saying about how he's the Incredible Hulk and he's going to smash us out of Europe, right? I listened to that press conference, okay, with Mr. Bettel, right? I listened to it as it was going out live. It is quite clear that they haven't changed their stance. All along they haven't changed their stance. Boris has gone there after bragging that he's going to get us out of Europe, he's going to smash us out, he's going to, get the deal of a lifetime, etc., etc. It's quite clear. He's gone there, he's got the same response that Theresa May got, they're not prepared to budge, and he's stormed off in a huff. What on earth was he going to say?
No, Simon, he hasn't stormed off in a huff. It would have been literally... Well, we don't know
because we didn't see him.
Hang on. The geography of this. There was his podium, just a few feet away from protesters who would have screamed and shouted him down at every opportunity. Surely the Luxembourg Prime Minister, if he'd wanted for Boris Johnson not to be humiliated in any way, would have moved the press conference indoors. Didn't do that, did he?
I don't believe it. They've already released the details.
It?
No, I don't believe it because they've already released the details saying that there was no option to do that. All right, so this can
there's always an option to do that.
Nigel.
There's always an option, Simon. Listen, if you're the Prime Minister, even of a little country like Luxembourg, there is always, believe me, always a plan B. All right? Of course there is.
what is it with this sense of entitlement? Okay, we want to. I'm not going to put me in this we, but we want to leave them. Why should they? They've got 27 other countries to look after.
So they should be abusive towards us, should they?
No, but they weren't abusive. He wasn't there to defend himself.
They were insulting. They were humiliating.
No, he wasn't there to defend himself, right? So this can only go down to one of two things. Either what you're saying and the way this has been spun is true, or my take on it is that he's gone there like the child that he is. He hasn't been able to get his own way. He's got egg on his face again, and so he's done a runner out the back door. And if I was going to give him some advice, Nigel, in the future, I'd say take a leaf out of your book. Make sure that you go in and out through the gents so that you can't get egg on your face if it goes wrong.
Well, Simon, I think what you're saying is utterly ridiculous. The idea that a British Prime Minister should have been put in a position where he'd be shouted down by renter mob and unable to get his message out. Listen, I'm not always Boris's biggest fan, but in this case, I disagree with you very strongly. I think he was humiliated. I think the Luxembourgers did all they could to humiliate him and make themselves feel big. But hey, we'll agree to disagree. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:15, and time for the news headlines with Lisa Aziz.
Boris Johnson says a new Brexit deal with Brussels is doable with energy and goodwill on both sides, despite EU officials insisting they still haven't seen any viable proposals to replace the problematic backstop. The London Fire Brigade says it's been interviewed.
I've talked about that, of course. I've been shouted down and laughed at, but we'll talk a bit more about the European Empire later on in this programme. But today, Boris was ritually humiliated. Does it make you think it really is time to leave? We're not dealing with reasonable people. It does me. Craig says, if you're British and like what happened in Luxembourg today, shame on you. Joe says, great that Boris walked out. Stephen says, Boris has told them, remove the backstop or there are no more negotiations. And if they're not prepared to do it, why are we wasting our time? And Emma from Leighton Buzzard says, I'm not a Brexiteer, I'm not a Boris fan, but the way the Prime Minister of Luxembourg spoke to him has made me really angry. Who is he to say anything about our country when his hypocritical little country is the size of a postage stamp? Well, Emma, OK, it is a little tiddler, and there are London boroughs with populations about the same size. But I wouldn't criticise Luxembourg for being small. There are lots of great small countries around the world. What I criticise them for is despite the fact they champion the euro and the single market, they've been able, it seems, to break many of the rules. I think it's a humiliation too far, this. I think it will actually backfire in terms of British public opinion. I think a lot more people will say, do you know what? The hell with this. We're wasting our time even talking to them. That's how rude they're going to be. And I have to tell you, Xavier Battle, the Prime Minister, laughing about Boris not being there, gesturing to the empty podium with the baying mob just a few feet away. Chris is calling from South Croydon. Good evening, Chris.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. Well, like you, I've got steam coming out of my ears.
Yeah, a lot of us have, I think, Chris. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it just shows what a thoroughly unpleasant bunch the EU are for a start. I'd like to remind these little countries like Luxembourg, Belgium and Holland that we gave them the benefit of our nuclear umbrella at considerable personal expense throughout the Cold War, and they owe our freedom to us. That's one thing for a start.
Yeah, and you could go back to previous generations,
yes,
Chris,
yes,
that have done a fair bit for their independence, but that perhaps is going back further than most people can remember or think about. Chris, it was a humiliation, wasn't it?
Oh yes, but the other point I'd like to make is the absurdity. Is a contradiction in terms, isn't it? Having a lunchtime meeting with old Juncker. It just occurs to me if he does actually manage to keep us in, the old blighter might actually neck a whole Jeroboam of champagne instead of his usual magnum and just finish himself off once and for all.
Well, all that we do know, Chris, what we do know about the lunch is that it was one of Juncker's favourite restaurants. And of course, don't forget, Juncker was the Prime Minister there for 19 years.
Yes.
And in many ways, a very good Prime Minister, because he managed to get Luxembourg, as I say, despite being great Europeans, apparently, to get different advantages from everybody else. We know they had snails to start. We know they had salmon for a main course. We know they had cheese afterwards. What we don't know is what was on the alcohol list. But if I know Juncker, and by the way, Chris, I mustn't be a hypocrite because I enjoy a glass of wine at lunch.
Same here,
no question. But I've been at many functions, when Mr. Juncker has been there at the table. And I feel almost like a teetotaler when Juncker's around.
Yeah.
So, Chris, is it time to open our eyes and to say we just need to leave?
Yes, certainly. But the other point I'd like to raise, I can't understand the mentality of those protesters. I mean, fancy actually applauding your country's enemies, such as Barnier, a cold fish like him, who's never run for office.
Well, some would say enemy is too strong a word. Chris, I wonder who the protesters were. I wonder where they came from. Because, as I say, I did a big British Chambers of Commerce event in Luxembourg not long ago, and most people there didn't agree with me, but it struck me that the expats in Luxembourg were very professional people working in accountancy and banking and things like that. I mean, not the sort of people that go out and carry placards. I wonder where they came from. I wonder whether they were shipped over, Chris.
Oh, well, I'm sure they were, but I would like to point out, if they ever do manage to keep us in, that's nothing to the demonstration that we will mount in Brussels, and I hope you'll help organise it.
Chris, I'm not allowed to do public disorder, but public order I will do. Chris, yes. I thank you very much indeed. Going on to Daniel, who's calling from Enfield. Daniel, good evening.
Hello, Nigel. Long time no talk. Look, I'm sick of this Brexit debacle. I didn't actually vote in the referendum, and I've sat on the fence for a long time. But we can't keep on going around like this, pussyfooting around. We're British, goddammit. We went through 2 world wars, and we won them single-handedly, didn't we? Well, a lot of your apostolites believe that.
Well, I think single-handed. I think single-handed to be wrong, Daniel. But go on.
Let me finish, right? Because at the end of the day, there's a little bump in the road, a no-deal Brexit. And there's real patriots out there who are reliant on us leaving on a no-deal Brexit. Real patriots who have bet against this country and bet against the pound, and they need to crash this country out to get the big payout. So what are we wasting time for? Let's do it. Who cares if there's some people
I don't buy
Who
that
cares
nonsense, Daniel.
If we can't get some vital life-saving medicines and people die, who cares? That's
what are you on about? Daniel, have you... I don't know whether you've been...
Our own government is saying that.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. The idea that medicines would be short is utter tosh, isn't it? So
if anyone dies, you'll put your neck on the line and say, you'll hand yourself in because you helped felicitate this.
What are you suggesting?
That's what you're saying.
What are you?
If someone dies,
let me ask you. Let me ask you the sanity question. Do you think?
Put your money where your mouth is.
Let me ask you the sanity. No, you're not sane, are you? No, you're clearly not sane. Do you think that the EU will be sinking ships coming across the Channel? Is that what's going to happen? Or where does this rubbish come from? From
our own government, our own dear leader.
No, it doesn't come from him, does it?
That is a recent report.
The recent report was produced.
That wasn't under Theresa May. That was last month.
It was produced by pen pushers, wasn't it? Pen pushers in Whitehall who don't want us to leave.
Yeah, okay, so if it does turn into this terrible situation, then what?
Daniel,
what happens if
what happens?
Food and supplies, and the cost of living goes up. And poor people can't survive.
And what happens, Daniel? If we're rich? No, Daniel, I'm bored with you. I'm bored with you. Go away. Let's speak to James, who's a new caller. Now, James, I want to keep you on the subject because my last caller wouldn't stay on the subject. The subject is, my view is Boris was humiliated. Others think he got his just desserts. Do scenes like that make it more likely that the general public think we should just leave?
Well, I was a Remainer, and I have been changed over the last while, finally shifting to being a more of what I'd call a Democrat rather than just a Brexiteer, but it's democracy is what you're standing up for. And I represent a lot of my friends who were Remainers have now been so embarrassed by the anti-democratic movements from the other side that they're coming to align with your thinking. And it's quite difficult to step into your program, by the way, because you listen on the telephone and everything's so heated. It's like
some callers ring up, James, because they want to have a fight.
It's like jumping into a tumble dryer.
But James, listen, I'm happy to listen to any opinion that agrees or disagrees. But if people just want to rant, then I clearly can't have a conversation. James, I think what you've just said to me is very interesting. I'm hearing that from quite a lot of people who say, look...
Can I praise you? Can I praise you? I'm sure you can tolerate it for a little bit. Something that I've watched and listened to since 2016 is that you're a rather remarkable politician. What you've done over the last 20 years, and this is becoming more and more evident, is you have listened to and identified a section of the population, a huge, silent majority who are very obedient, very quiet. They keep their head down. They don't go and vote often. They work hard. And they're the backbone of the country, and they have felt totally unrepresented. And you have embraced them, and you have kicked the doors open of the public debate, and you have got them representation in Parliament for the first time for a very, very long time. And that's a tremendous
Well, thank you. That's very, 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 very kind of you, James. Thank you. And
your movement is changing from just Brexit, is that you are, and the idea is coalescing around democracy itself.
That's what matters. Yes, absolutely.
You're a Democrat.
Absolutely. And that's what matters. And James, you can dislike the result of an election or a referendum, but if you're a Democrat, you have to respect it. It's the principle of losers' consent. And once that breaks down, civility breaks down with it. James, you're very sweet. Thank you very much indeed for your call. On YouTube, I get Boris is smart. Who in their right mind would freely walk into a press trap? No, it would have been absolute madness for Boris to walk into that. Christine on Facebook says, the Luxembourgers deliberately sought, as usual, to humiliate RPM. Unlike Mrs May, he didn't stand around and accept it. And yet there were times, I have to say, when May was treated so badly, and you'd see the photographs of them walking from the summit to lunch, and she'd be on her own and they'd all be bunched together, and all sorts of little things they were putting out on Twitter and Instagram about her. And not to mention, of course, her having to leave Downing Street at 4:15 in the morning to go and meet a deadline on the 8th of December 2017. Boris, at least, walked out, and I think it was the right thing to do. And I think more and more people will say their behaviour is so unreasonable. In a moment, we'll talk about the EU becoming an empire. Yeah, and this is not me speaking. Please don't blow a gasket. It's Guy Verhofstadt. But for now, you're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:30 in time for the news. with Lisa Aziz.
Boris Johnson.
It's as if the whole thing through speakers was set up. Very, very strange indeed, I thought. But another story that really has not caught enough attention in my view. Now, you know, Jo Swinson, new leader of the Lib Dems, is down in Bournemouth for their conference. Gosh, they've been lucky with the weather. And she's going for revoke. That's their new just cancel the referendum result. And that is the Lib Dems' new big policy if they win the next general election. And already some people like Sir Norman Lamb are saying, well, we're not happy with this. It's not really very democratic. So she has got some internal dissent over it, but not, I think, that much. But it was the visit from the Belgian Liberal Guy Verhofstadt and his speech yesterday. Now, I have argued for years they're building a superstate. They're building an empire, they want an army, they want to expand, we should have no part of it. And of course, Nick Clegg and everybody else has said, oh, Nigel, you're living on Fantasy Island, you're just scaremongering the public. Listen to what one of the senior players in the European Union, and indeed the European Parliament's chief negotiator on Brexit, listen to his vision of the future of the European project.
The world order of tomorrow is not a world order based on nation states or countries. It's a world order that is based on empires. China is not a nation. It's a civilization, Han. India, you know it better than I do, is not a nation. There are 2,000 nations in India. There are 20 different languages that are used there. There are 4 big religions at the same time. It is the biggest democracy worldwide. The US is also an empire, more than a nation. Maybe tomorrow they will speak there more Spanish than English. I don't know what will happen. And then finally the Russian Federation. The world of tomorrow is a world of empires in which we European and you British can only defend your interest, your way of life by doing it together in a European framework and in the European Union.
There we are. The usual ranting Verhofstadt. I'm used to him. He's always like that. He is fanatical. It is to be an empire. And the individual nation states, they have to go because they're old hat, their history. And it was very interesting to see that Andrew Adonis, who, of course, I've spoken to many times before here at LBC, who really is one of the fanatics for Remain. Even Adonis said, I don't believe in a European empire, but a free European Union. The world has had enough of empires. Well, hear to that, Lord Adonis, but that is where they're going. That is what they want, because Barroso, one of the previous bosses of the European Commission, he said, we're building the first ever non-militaristic empire. They're building an empire. Why deny it? Ross from Chislehurst wants to comment on this. Good evening, Ross.
Good evening, Nigel. I'd just like to say that the world is no longer structured in a unipolar way where the U.S. rules the roost. China is becoming more important. A strong Europe is therefore more important if we want to actually combat the threat that China poses. And
what, you mean go to war with them, Ross, or...?
No, not to go to war with them.
Because competing empires normally, often end up in wars, don't they?
It's not necessarily about empires. It's about power, and it's about the structure of power around the world. After the Cold War, the U.S. became the sole power, and now the U.S. is probably on the decline. I'll say this as an American, and China's on the rise. And if we're going to accept, I don't think you want to accept, but if we withdraw from the European Union, if we withdraw from Europe, we're going to have less influence, less ability to actually combat China.
But if we stay in the European Union, under the model that's being built, we won't be a nation state anymore.
Well, I think we'll still be a nation, maybe not a state. And this is something important.
The days of nation states and countries are over, Verhofstadt just said.
Yeah, I think his comments might be a little bit confused.
He's not. No. He's not, Ross. He's not confused. Believe you me. I'm off to the European Parliament tomorrow. There's hundreds of them that say that.
Can I just say, I think he might agree with me when I say that it's not so much the nation state. It's about getting rid of the state, one uniform state. And still recognizing there being different nations, the UK, France, Germany, all the other nations of the European Union. But just like in the UK, we have 4 countries, 4 nations ruled by one state, central UK government. You can still preserve your Scottishness, your Englishness, your Welshness, but you're just ruled by a different authority. I think that's mainly what Europe is about.
A little bit different with us in France. Ross, I've got Joyce has rung in with a different point of view. Joyce, you've heard what Ross has had to say. What do you make of that?
Well, I tried to get through to you yesterday, Nigel, because I listened to Verhofstadt at the Liberal and Democratic conference.
Right.
And he also pointed out that Europe has got to be galvanised against any threats. And what he was really saying, Nigel, I don't know if you agree with me, that something like Brexit should never happen again. Did you pick up on that?
Yeah. Well, he doesn't just want Brexit never to happen again. He wants to reverse Brexit, doesn't he?
Yeah, and this guy was treated like a demigod. And he made my blood boil.
Did he?
He actually scared me with his rantings to hysteria. But I'm a Brexiteer, Nigel, and I think he's done you a good favour.
Yeah, I agree with you. Joyce, I agree with you.
Play his rantings on your campaign
So Ross, Joyce thinks that Verhofstadt's ranting, and so do I. What do you think?
I think there's maybe a little bit of that. But can I just say as well, if you think that Europe can be just as strong without the UK, then I think ultimately you're undermining the strength of the UK. You're saying that the UK cannot actually contribute to the European project because it's not strong enough. It will be absorbed. It will be taken over by these other European countries, and I just don't agree with that. Well, and I think that's a very important.
Well, Ross, I don't want to be part of something whose courts can overrule us, whose laws we have to abide by, and ultimately who want us to militarily integrate. I do not believe that's in our interest or the world's interests.
But integrate, that assumes that we're just going to be subsumed under this kind of umbrella of just bureaucrats that we have nothing to do with. We will.
Well, that's the plan.
Involvement.
That's the plan. We will. There'll be British voices in there, of course. But
where do these people? Where do they come from? Where do the bureaucrats come from? They come from nations. They come from the institutions of these countries, of the UK, and they will largely have a part in how.
But they don't. But they don't believe in the nation state themselves. So the concept of national interest disappears completely.
Well, okay. Let's say they don't agree with the concept of nation state, which I slightly disagree with. But as things are progressing, as things are moving forward, I don't understand how having individual nation states is going to be beneficial for the future. How it's going to help us.
All I know, Ross, and the way you're speaking really scares me. It really scares me. This sort of a little bit like sort of 1890s Germany. Britain's too big. We must build more ships. We must challenge them. We must compete with them. The idea of competing empires, I think, is a really dangerous concept. But Ross, against what you're saying and against what Verhofstadt's saying, actually, in 1945, There were about 55 countries in the world. There are now roughly 220 countries in the world, and every single year new countries are being created. I do not believe that the age of a nation state is dead.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. I just think in terms of what we're looking at in Europe, I think, and the challenges that we're trying to surmount, including climate change and lots of other pertinent issues, it's really important that we come together as a world and therefore as probably a stronger unity of nation states to help and defeat them. That's it.
Ross, no, that's fine. Listen, Ross, but thank you. We disagree, but you've made your point very well in a very civil way. Thank you. Please, if you disagree with me, that's great. I do want to hear. The audience want to hear. But if you're ringing up and want to have a rant and just scream down the phone, then it really is a bit of a waste of time for all of us. Tierney says on Facebook, I'm all for cooperation but not domination. Michael says, we know all about empires. We need no lessons from them. Let's take a break, shall we? And we're going to come back. Enough of the Hofstadt for now. Let's get back to Boris Johnson, the way he was treated earlier. Let's get back to him. My thesis is the more the British public see of the way EU leaders and Eurocrats behave towards British Prime Ministers, the more they'll conclude there's no fair dealing with these people. We simply have to leave. That's my view. Tell me I'm right, tell me I'm wrong. It's now 6:45. Time for the news headlines with Lisa Aziz.
Boris Johnson says a new Brexit deal with Brussels is doable with energy and goodwill on both sides, despite EU officials insisting they still haven't seen any viable proposals to replace the problematic Irish backstop. Two former British Army paratroopers...
Well, Boris didn't turn up to that press conference in Luxembourg today. I can't say I blame him with a mob of protesters just a few yards away. I think they were out to humiliate him. I think the whole thing was a disgrace. That's what I think. What does Leroy think from Harrow on the Hill? Good evening, Leroy.
How you doing? You okay?
Yeah, fine. Look, I really think it was a pretty low stunt that was pulled in Luxembourg today, Leroy.
Yeah, I get that from listening to you. I haven't seen it yet or anything like that on the news, but I've only been listening to you guys for the past 45 minutes or so.
Okay. Well, you heard the noise, didn't you? You heard the noise of the booing.
Yeah, I heard it all. Yeah, there's nothing I haven't heard before, but the flavour I'm sort of getting from it is like, you're talking about this ritual humiliation.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't turn up to get humiliated, to be honest with you. He, in my eyes, he sort of humiliated himself by not going up. What I believe, really, my background's boxing, and what I think is you're not showing up to the gig, it says a hell of a lot. If he'd have turned up, stood at the podium, and people were booing him, and he's there with his Boris face on going, look, guys, I'm trying to talk, and they were booing, talk over him, and he looks and he says, look, you know what? I can't do this. Sorry, guys. I'd have a little bit of respect for him. I think, well, he's made a bit of a martyr for himself.
So he could have played. He could have played it. He could have boxed clever, Leroy. That's what you're saying.
He could have boxed clever. He could have showed up and showed face and showed willing.
Yeah, okay.
And said, yeah, okay, I'm here, but look at these people. Well, guys, look, I can't get a word in edgeways, so look, I better go. We wouldn't be here now. He didn't show up, but there's a reason for that. I think there were other people who were talking earlier on who were saying, he didn't turn up because he didn't want to be confronted. These guys are pulling him over the coals. I think that's what's got to him. And also, on another point of what you said, is like, you're talking about this guy, I've never pronounced it right, Juncker.
Well, Juncker is the president of the European Commission and is the former Prime Minister.
I'm aware of his. I just can't pronounce his name properly. But the fact that you sort of mentioned that, and it was outrageous, like, he gestured towards
this was Bettel. This was Xavier Bettel, the Prime Minister. So he gestured towards the empty podium and laughed, and it was very mocking, Leroy.
Yes, I know, but it's the exact words you're saying. They do that in the house every day. It's like Banksy's thing of the apes.
Right, Leroy, I'm going to take issue with you here. Your first point you made is a very interesting point. That actually to stand there and be shouted down, he might have got through that quite cleverly. Wouldn't have been easy, but I get the point. Right. On this point, right? Okay, yeah, sure. In the House of Commons, that sort of thing goes on. Of course it does.
Yeah.
But the leader of a country does not normally humiliate the leader of another country when they're on the home territory. It's a wrong thing to do. Boris was the visitor, and for the host nation's Prime Minister to have done... Leroy, it was damn rude.
For example, but finally, what I say as well is I thought that was a bit rough. This is where we've got... You just said, like, we're talking on a nice level and everything should be done and it's all etiquette and all the rest of it the good old English way.
Yeah.
Yet you're referring to this guy's drinking.
No, I'm not being... listen.
Not on.
Oh, come off it. Come off it.
No, I don't. I have a laugh when I'm sitting down with my mates, but you're just talking about a guy sitting there, who's the leader of a country. You're on a radio show and stuff like that, and we're talking about something that's happened that's out of order, but yet you're talking about this guy, he likes a glass of wine and all that. Do you know what? You're not doing us any favours. If this guy's tuning into this, he's going to be thinking, yeah, okay.
Oh, actually,
So I
listen.
me personally.
I know Juncker very well, and on a personal level, I get on with him just fine. All right, I get on with him just fine. In fact, we have a laugh and a joke together. We have different points of view, and I find it quite refreshing, given how polar politics is. And some may say I've been part of causing that, but given the polarity of politics and the fact you can get on with people from different points of view is really important. So I wasn't mocking him, and frankly, when it comes to his drinking, he talks about it himself. Leroy, great call. Interesting thought, though. Leroy's thought, interesting, that maybe if Boris had stood there and been screamed at, he could have got the nation even more on his side by showing just how unfair the whole thing was. But I do understand why he didn't. Tracy is a new caller from Chesterfield. Good evening, Tracy.
Hello, Nigel. Yeah, thanks for speaking to me.
Welcome. So, I mean, was it a humiliation for Boris?
I just think Boris shouldn't have stood there, so he didn't. He's more professional than that. You don't treat one leader of a country doesn't treat another leader like that, like you said.
Yes.
And we are a fully paid up member still, don't forget. I mean, we've paid, 40 billion into the EU since we voted to leave.
We've promised, much of it's to come, Tracy, but we are still paying. And by the way, I'll do a feature tomorrow night on the fact that on the fact that our contributions are going up sharply. But yeah,
I mean, we ought to be having some of that money back, didn't we? Being as we voted leave ages ago.
Well, you'd have thought it so, but unfortunately,
I'm a very angry leaver.
Are you?
In a town that voted leave.
Yep.
And it hasn't been honoured by a Remain MP.
There are so many. There are so many
of us.
Millions, Tracy. I was looking at some figures in Wales today, and the Welsh Assembly and Welsh MPs are a very, very Remain bunch. And I was looking at the figures, and over 75% of the council areas in Wales voted leave, and they feel just as you feel. But that's a separate subject, Tracy. But we will come back to it.
I'm going off piste a bit.
All right, but I know. But thank you for picking up the phone. I understand your anger. I think you're right on balance that Boris, it would have been wrong to allow himself to have been humiliated. I get the previous point, but it would have been wrong. Thank you very much for your call. Harry is a new caller from Sheffield. Good evening, Harry.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening. So what do you make of today's performance?
Well, I think, first of all, the performance of today, I think what the EU are trying to do is trying to make us look like a joke to the rest of the EU states. And then it prevents any other countries from wanting to leave. If we look like a joke, then I think other countries will not want to follow the leave process anymore. We've been here for 3 years. It's just caused trouble, and the rest of the EU states can see that. And I think it's just going to restrict what's happened in this country, and it's just going to make us look like a joke, essentially. But on another point, I'm a Lib Dem voter.
Okay.
And I'm a very liberal person. I did vote leave.
Yes.
And I voted leave for various reasons. It wasn't to do with race. It wasn't to do with immigration. It was to do with the whole democratic process itself in Europe.
Well, Harry, can I just ask you a question then? So I mean, there are lots of people, by the way, who would call themselves classical liberals who would have voted leave, and I understand that completely. But how do you square right now being a Lib Dem voter with the Joe Swinson policy of revoking Article 50?
Well, I think it's completely undemocratic. And, there are a lot of people who are classical liberals in the Lib Dem party who voted leave. Maybe it's not, obviously, a high percentage, but there's still a large majority, well, not a majority, a large minority of people who would have voted leave. And not only are you alienating them sort of people in the party, the classical liberals, it means that we've got no one to vote for anymore, which further divides politics itself.
Yeah, well, no, Harry, I get the point. Thank you. I'm going to take one last quick call. Douglas is a new caller from Dubai. Good evening, Douglas.
Hi, Nigel.
Thank you for calling.
I've just got a suggestion. I think Boris should put down the gauntlet with Labour and the Lib Dems and offer them another referendum. Leave or leave. Leave under WTO terms or leave under free trade with the EU. Fishing waters, courts, borders, free trade with the rest of the world, those aren't negotiable. And so let the voters choose. Either leave with free trade or leave under WTO.
Yeah.
And make it...
I don't think the Labour or the Lib Dems are going to accept that, Douglas, after all. For them, it's not about how we leave. For them, it's about stopping leave from happening, isn't it?
Yeah, but going back to an earlier subject about the European empire,
yes.
Haven't they learnt from the Soviet Union? That didn't work.
Well, I tell you what, Douglas, I'm out of time, I'm sorry, but just a quick observation from me. I often think they're just recreating it, basically, but hey. I'll be back tomorrow at 6 from Strasbourg. At 10 tonight, it's Tom Swarbrick, but up next, it's Ian Dale.
Nigel, thank you very much indeed. Well, coming up at 8, we will be convening our Monday night panel, where we're going to try and guide you through the events of the next few days. Not that we know what the next few days are going to be. We have the Supreme Court making its decision on Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament.